So it's time for another edition of our Wednesday feature where we focus on the unconventional side of the law. It's called So Now What? And we're joined once again by our expert lawyer and director at Legalese.co.za, Eitan Stern. Good to have you here with us, sir. Now, today, taking into light the recent uproar against and the fury about the state of gender-based violence in our country, we'll be focusing on what your legal rights and recourses are when it comes to addressing the legal side of gender-based violence. A very, very important discussion that we need to have right now in this country. And I mean, I'm sure you've been reading so many stories and taking in so many articles and perspectives online in this past week. So let's start first by maybe defining what counts or what is defined as sexual harassment in the general sense.
Okay, cool. So sexual harassment in South Africa is defined as any conduct of a sexual nature which essentially is without consent and which leaves the other person's dignity being infringed or leaving them feeling intimidated or embarrassed in any way. And so obviously in South Africa, well, we all should know, and anyone who doesn't know is a serious issue, that something like rape is definitely not allowed, but there's a lot of harassment that happens just in the everyday, life and everyday workforce sometimes that contributes to the bigger problem. Yeah. And this can be stuff like, unwanted comments, unwanted messages on WhatsApp or the internet, threats of a sexual nature, or even offers of reward. And these all count as sexual harassment in South Africa.
So you're talking about literally, I mean, not even confining it just to the workspace or an office, but for instance, walking down the street and having somebody catcall you, or make verbal comments regarding something of a sexual nature. That is illegal.
Yes, 100%. That's what in South Africa we've got the Sexual Offences Act, and it covers all these different offences which can be illegal and or considered sexual harassment. So catcalling is an interesting one. What you're essentially doing is that you're giving a verbal assault to someone which might infringe their dignity, leave them feeling intimidated, and that can certainly be considered sexual harassment. 100% when catcalling is done in a work setting, so in an office environment, that's 100% definitely illegal.
Yeah. I had a very interesting conversation with a friend of mine the other day who encountered this, being catcalled.
Yeah.
And their instinct was to react in that moment. Because, I mean, you talk about infringing on their humanity and perhaps feeling intimidated. Right, and them wanting to react. We'll get to sexual harassment in the workplace, but I want to talk a little bit about what course of action are you, as the person to whom that sexual harassment comment is perpetrated, what course of action are you allowed to take legally within your rights to feel safe and protected? Because you don't necessarily know what another person's intentions
100%.
are.
Yeah. 100%. So it's really important that we start talking about, what victims' rights are in South Africa. So if it's done in a work setting, you can 100% definitely within your rights to go to your management and to do something about it in the work setting, because no one should be sexually harassed in that work.
And your management is then obliged to act.
100%.
They must act.
They have to act. And if they don't act, then there's some pretty serious consequences. If they can't sweep it under the carpet or say it didn't happen because or not look into it, they have to act on it. Outside of that setting, it's important for victims to speak out. So you can go to the police and speak about it. All sexual crimes should be reported to the police. Unfortunately, we've got some bigger systemic issues that people don't have faith in the policing system, but it's really important for people to report these things to the police. If these things persist, you can also get a protection order against someone that is continuously harassing you. And again, that's something you go to the police for and then eventually approach a magistrate and you get a protection order. You can also, if someone has caused harm or damage against you by harassment, you can put what's called a civil claim. You can essentially sue them for it because they've caused damage to you. And so that's also something that's within our rights. And then obviously it's quite a difficult thing to approach the police, and it can be quite a big, quite a scary incident for a victim. So there's lots of organizations out there like Rape Crisis and organizations for gender-based violence that can help women and help victims talk about these things and bring them forward. So it's, the most important thing, there are options where people can talk about it, but the most important thing is that people come forward and don't let these things just sit unspoken about, because that's what's part of what contributes to this problem.
Yeah. Not sure whether you are allowed to answer this question,
Sure.
but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
In your legal opinion, do you believe that the South African law is sufficient to protect victims? Is it doing enough? Is there enough protection given to victims all the way through from the very instance of reporting to finding justice at the end for crime?
So it's a great question, and probably a big part of the discussion that people are having at the moment. And there's there's a number of aspects to it. The law in itself is very comprehensive and really good. The problem is that law isn't always implemented properly. So we've got problems with the way it's policed. We've got problems with the way it's reported. We've got problems with, once it has been reported, with gathering evidence against the perpetrators. So, while the laws might be good, our society as a whole and our system as a whole is quite broken and definitely needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And
Great to have you here, Eitan. We're going to be continuing our chat very shortly, and of course you can throw forward those questions onto our Facebook page, Expresso Morning Show SABC3, very shortly as we continue with So Now What?
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. This is your Feel Good Breakfast Show. It's a Wednesday morning and great to be in your company. Thanks for joining us at the start of a brand new day as we continue our discussion with lawyer and director at Legalese.co.za, Eitan Stern, about what your legal rights are when it comes to addressing the legal side of gender-based violence. Of course, we all know what has been happening in our country over the past week, and so important and timeless it is for us to have this discussion right now. And we do appreciate you answering our questions.
Sure,
Eitan.
it's really important for us to talk about this.
The reporting of sexual harassment or sexual assault has come under the spotlight.
Yes.
Let's talk about the process of reporting it and what would be an ideal, and then we'll take that a step further and apply it to maybe certain practical instances. What is the ideal when it comes to the reporting?
Okay. So I suppose the ideal is, you need to report it to the police. A big aspect of any reporting is all around evidence. Now, it's come under spotlight in South Africa, and people have saying, well, perpetrators have too many rights when it comes to sexual assault. And the reality is, in our constitutional democracy, and any constitutional democracy, people are innocent until proven guilty, and the bar to prove someone guilty of a crime is quite high. You have to prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So, so essentially it all comes down to evidence. And unfortunately, with a lot of crimes in general, but certainly sexual-based crimes, there often isn't evidence, or there's often insufficient evidence. So, the most important thing is really to gather evidence in these things. And so there are a lot of rights afforded to victims that are reporting crimes and after the crime's been reported. But of course, it's all about, if this thing actually goes to trial, it's about weighing up aspects of evidence. So what's important to do? You have to report it to the police. And gather as much evidence as you can, and then follow the process through, because as we've said, the police's processes are often very inefficient and very problematic. So sometimes these things do take a bit of a push, unfortunately.
You talk about evidence being the overwhelming criteria, if you will, for the reporting and then the subsequent steps that follow. Would you say, based on that the legal system is more pro-perpetrator or pro-victim? Because a lot of people might say, why doesn't the law believe the victim first and then ask the perpetrator to prove themselves innocent? And I'm asking this literally as a layman, just trying to understand how the law works.
It's an interesting question. And I mean, I suppose that there's a lot of legal history to why it's worked like that. And why people have this presumption of innocence. I need to stretch my mind back to the early days in law school to remember the history of it. But that's the way that our legal system stands. It's got problems with it. The legal system in general has problems, but it's a pretty proven way, a pretty good way for our system to run. That people are, innocent until proven guilty, and that's just sort of the way it is. So evidence is really, really important for us to gather when reporting any crime.
Given that a lot of people don't necessarily trust the legal or the justice system in our country, it may sometimes lead to victims taking longer to
sure.
report
Yeah.
crimes against them. Does that play a role at all in how this particular evidence and
Yeah.
the reporting is perceived, especially from the
100%,
base?
and this is something that's a real, I don't want to call it an issue, but it's a real thing within gender-based violence, that people are quite obviously scared to report.
Yes.
Often they live under intimidation and fear, so they're scared to bring these things forward. So at the moment, there's a context within gender-based violence of people bringing these accusations forward many years later.
Yes.
Finally, part of the Me Too movement, women suddenly have the confidence to do it. And I think that's a fantastic thing. There's no prescription for a crime. So, you can bring a crime forward, 20 years later, and if you've got evidence to say that it happened, well then, the crime can be tried. And we've seen examples in the United States and some in South Africa of people going to trial for things that happened many years ago. And unfortunately, this is just something that needs to happen, in order to get to the ideal of people bringing these issues forward right away.
Yeah. So let's talk about the sort of punishment that somebody
Sure.
who's been charged with sexual assault or sexual harassment can get.
Okay, so it's a very wide range of punishment, and it can go from just very light punishments without any jail time to a maximum of life imprisonment for serious offences such as rape. So it's a very wide-ranging thing. There is a lot of focus at the moment saying the punishment is too light. So I imagine you're going to start to see some harsher sentences being dealt towards rapists and also towards people that do the everyday, what's become common aspects of sexual harassment in our society that shouldn't be common at all.
And then lastly, if we could tap into this a little bit, because it's also been a big focus point, the issue of consent.
Sure.
And how that is weighed up in the law and applied.
So this is the most crucial thing about the whole thing. The difference between a sexual act and a sexual harassment is often this idea of consent. And consent is where two parties are quite clearly and have beyond a shadow of a doubt consenting to an action that's going on. Consent can't be given if someone is drunk or under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Consent can't be given while sleeping. So consent has to be a verbal thing. Consent can be given and it can be taken away. So at all moments during any sort of act, someone must be consenting to it. And if they're not in any way, then that person is not consenting, and then that sexual act can be turning to sexual harassment. So, it's very important for all of us, all the guys, all the girls in this world, for us also to really start to interact with this idea of consent, really understand it, because that's really where the big part, when someone's enjoying it and when someone's being harassed.
Yeah, Eitan, thank you very much.
Sure.
Appreciate it, and we hope that was a conversation in which you definitely did find insight and enlightenment. And of course, if you're looking for more information and questions to be answered, you can, of course, visit legalese.co.za. And of course, there is the Stop Gender Violence movement, and there's a number for you to call should you be seeking any kind of help. It should be on your screen right now, 0800 150 150. You can also dial star 120 star 7867 hash for more information. Thanks a lot, Eitan.